Hello, World Mythology students. It's Adam, and tonight I want to talk a little bit about archetypes. I want to try to keep this relatively short. I'm trying to keep these videos short because I just find that it works better that way for you all. Archetypes are really important to the study of mythology because probably who you might consider the founding father of world mythology is Joseph Campbell. The study of world mythologies is Joseph Campbell, and he is deeply indebted to the analytical psychology of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung was a contemporary, near contemporary of Sigmund Freud, and they sort of went their different directions. Psychoanalysis for Freud and analytical psychology for Jung. And Jung was all about sort of exploring the collective unconscious in the process of individuation, sort of finding out that process of self-discovery, finding out who you are. And this is really important for the study of mythology because the collective unconscious really sort of is kind of like the bedrock theory behind where someone like Joseph Campbell is talking about all these different patterns that are recurring. His famous work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is based on the idea of a monomyth, the idea that there is a story, a deeply embedded story within our unconscious. It's this idea that the story, no matter where, what time period, there's something fundamental about the human psyche, the way that we're structured, the way that our minds work, that this story causes us to think about heroes in a certain way. And it's about a process of conceivably of self-discovery, or it could be victory construed in sort of, that self-discovery construed in victory over an enemy, the typical story of protagonist, antagonist. So it gets very complicated, but I want to try to give some basics. So archetypes, we could call them, if I had to define them, recurring symbols, memes, plot structures, character types, and settings. So these are basically the building blocks of myth. They recur over and over again. People like Jung would talk about, I guess you could call it the old wise man, Mother Earth, the shadow, the villain. You might have animus, anima, the idea of the male, female, soul, the differences between the genders there with their soul, perhaps. These patterns, these archetypes, are sort of the building blocks of this collective unconscious. Light versus darkness. Male, female. These binaries, these fundamental human binaries that we experience on a daily basis. So examples include, for example, if we were to talk about a peaceful, bucolic, sort of nature-perfected setting, such as the Garden of Eden in the Book of Genesis, or even the bucolic Shire from The Lord of the Rings. The hero journey plot. The hero journey plot is really interesting. That is one that I think I'm going to make another short video on. Actually, I may not, because I did actually post another video for you there that is actually really helpful and probably better than what I could do overall, just because of it just lays it out for you. So the hero journey plot is a plot archetype, and you also have significance attached to all sorts of other things in the world around us. Something like the sacred and the profane with respect to religious rituals. You got shapes, for example, numbers, images, connections to religious experience, and the expression of religion in the world. So these building blocks are what myth makers draw upon. I guess it's almost like we draw upon within the well of the collective unconscious to create our vision of the world through mythology. And of course, I've talked about this before, most of the time myth has a constructive purpose. It builds community. It teaches children the way to live. It basically outlines the safe places, the not safe places, the safe people, the not safe people, the good qualities, the bad qualities. Again, I'm talking in basic binaries here. And that's why mythology is so fundamental, because it's about this, not that. And that is sort of fundamental to the human experience. I mean, programming literally is just, computer programming literally is binary. It's a yes or no, a 0 or a 1. And that at that sort of fundamental human level of this, not that, this is how the accretions of experience built upon, as someone like Jung would argue, the fundamental human experiences This is what causes people from different parts of the world to have stories that share certain values. I'm in the process of going through Gilgamesh again, and I'm just amazed at how much Gilgamesh speaks to today's world, just as much as it does to the world nearly 4,000 years ago. And that is really why I was sitting in my car listening to Gilgamesh, and I was like, wow, this is why this course is so powerful and interesting. It's because you have stories that are that old, that are speaking to concerns that still haunt us today. Gilgamesh does not want to die. He has seen his friend Enkidu die, and he has traveled at great length through parts of the underworld. He's got past Scorpion Men. Urshanabi has taken him over. He's over there with Utnapishtim, and he desperately wants to find out the secret to immortality. And Utnapishtim is sort of like, you look at your life, and this is just the order of things. And he's teaching him truths, but Gilgamesh sort of represents that urge to know. They just want to know, and you want to have it. That human urge to just, I want to feel okay. I want things to be okay. And Utnapishtim is like, well, they are okay. It's just that this is a part of the process, and you have to respect that this life will have an end. And it's a really powerful story. I'm glad I'm listening to it again. I love audiobooks, by the way, because Gilgamesh is speaking to us just as much today as it spoke to the world around 1700 or even earlier BCE. And that's the power of myth. These are lessons that recur. I mean, this story speaks to us still today. All cultures use archetypes. I mean, everybody builds with building blocks. And if archetypes are the basic building blocks and patterns of myths, and cultures tell stories about themselves, then it stands to reason that they use these archetypes to build their stories. Now, this is not uncontroversial because first of all, you have to have a couple of leaps of faith here. One, you have to accept the idea that there's a collective unconscious, and some of the tenets of analytical psychology, dream analysis, is a real big deal in that field. Psychoanalysis as well. Interpretation of dreams, interpretations of your experiences through some of these archetypes, right? So you have to sort of accept some of those. You also have to accept the idea that there are shared human experiences across time and space. And that is not uncontroversial because some people would say, well, this culture is completely different in a completely different historical and geographical context and speaks to that culture in that context in ways that this one does not. And so the process of studying world mythology, there is an assumption that you are trying to compare things that some would argue, like Jung and Joseph Campbell, that yes, they are comparable, right? We can find fundamental elements. And some people would say, no, this is almost like, I talk about microhistory a lot. Microhistory is specific local histories of different places. You almost could use the term micro-mythological. This is a key feature of the mythologies of this place and this time with this people in this culture, but not of this time, this place, this people, and this other culture. So when I talk about these archetypes, I'm already sort of accepting the idea that these patterns recur. I don't necessarily have to accept the idea that the collective unconscious is a real thing and it's sort of this well that we all draw upon as a common shared human experience. But I still, have to at least say that these patterns recur in human experience, whether there's some sort of brain, pathways that are built or fundamental neural pathways that just are what they are. So please keep that in mind. This is not uncontroversial when you study world mythology. And if you ever watch Joseph Campbell speak and listen to him, it's clear that he's a real, true believer in the idea of depth psychology. I guess you could call it the dream analysis, and just really these deep experiences that he would argue speak to a connection with every other human experience around the world in the sense of that core fundamental level. So other examples include the hero, obviously, the damsel in distress, right? The battle between good and evil. Good versus evil is a major one. Bargaining with the devil, etc. We've got all sorts of plot archetypes. I've talked about the idea of hero journey. We'll talk a little bit. Well, actually, like I said, that other video probably does a better job than I do. Other archetypes that are really important within the sort of plot narratives is the idea of ordering chaos. This is a fundamental sort of binary here, order versus chaos. It's the idea that there was chaos and it had to be ordered, and it must maintain being ordered. A really excellent example of this is Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse mythology. And by the way, the world tree is one of these fundamental archetypes for Jung and others. But Yggdrasil, this tree, the Norns, who are the fates of Norse mythology, they are desperately always trying to keep this tree alive and well, despite the squirrel, Ratatosk, and all these other critters eating at its branches, and the dragons and everything around. They're basically trying to fight the entropy of all the worlds connected through the world tree there. Midgard, of course, and Asgard, some of the main ones, but you got elves and dwarves and all that other stuff as well. And so the idea of ordering chaos and keeping the chaos at bay. This shows up in Egyptian mythology, keeping the Lord of Chaos Set, keeping him at bay through the ordering of Egyptian society. The desert, of course, to the ancient Egyptians, represents chaos and death. Getting lost in the desert alone, it's not a good idea because that's where people die. You don't have water. You don't have those fundamental needs available to you. I often talk about this with all of my students at all levels, but fundamental human needs determine how we think about, the world. And for the ancient Egyptians, they lived, typically it's argued that on a 7-mile stretch on one side of the Nile and a 7-mile stretch on the other side of the Nile, of course you get the cataracts of the Nile at the top as it goes through Egypt. People lived in that part of the Nile River Valley and not in the desert, because that's where death lay and lurked. And this is, of course, Set is the Lord of Chaos, he is the Lord of the desert. And there you have it. You have this idea of keeping the chaos at bay. And this is, another thing, a lot of religions have the idea of, the sun god always has to go over and over again. You have these, monthly and annual, rituals and practices that people undergo to sort of celebrate and support the idea of keeping the chaos at bay. Most of the ancient world, the pre-modern world, they structured their lives around agriculture, around the rhythms of, the harvest, etc. Not all of them were agricultural, but pastoral as well. And you just have, the weather changes. You've got, the rhythms, the cyclical rhythms of every single culture. They're not all the same, of course, but, those patterns of nature and people, attaching meaning to that with respect to keeping order in their lives and keeping chaos at bay is a really fundamental, as Jung would talk about, like an archetype there. The battle between good and evil, obviously a major point there. Rituals, so many of ancient cultures, and still today, have rites of passage. Rites of passage for people moving, especially from that sort of like youth, child to adult, usually around the age of, 12, 13 or so, rites of passage. A young man or a young woman becomes an adult through a process, and there are stories associated with this. You also have stories of dying and rising gods. You have these gods and goddesses who sacrifice themselves for the community or for some reason, and then they come back. One of the classic examples of the dying and rising god is someone like Jesus of Nazareth, of course. This is one of those theories that is not uncontroversial. A lot of people are like, oh, that's so old. But guess what? This is something that mythologists and historians of mythology have been arguing about for a long time. We've got gods and goddesses, of course, oftentimes are seen as living high up in the sky, the mountains, and, the underworld, a place for demons and ghouls and the undead or the dead who just need to stay dead. This is the brutal part of Gilgamesh for me, is because Enkidu is dead, and Gilgamesh is just, he can't get over it. Like, this is why he's traveled so far to find Utnapishtim. He can't get over the fact that Enkidu has gone away. Light and darkness. Light, of course, represents intellectual illumination. Darkness suggests the unknown, despair, not knowing. And of course, I talked about this in another video. Humans are diurnal creatures, so we sleep at night and we do our things during the day. And this, of course, would influence the way we think about the sun and the moon, and these different light and darkness. There are many, many character archetypes. There are tons and tons of character archetypes. I know on your archetype analysis sheet, I'm looking for you to really try to expand and try to find some mythological examples here. But you've got people like heroes, mentors. I've actually been listening to an essay about Gilgamesh, that Gilgamesh perhaps is an anti-hero, because why do he and Enkidu go to the cedar forest to face Humbaba? Are they trying to do it? Is Humbaba doing anything bad to them? Or do they just want glory for themselves? Are they being, is Gilgamesh arrogant and wants glory for him and his friend? And this editor is arguing that Gilgamesh is in a sense an anti-hero, and Gilgamesh is complex. It's not suggesting that Gilgamesh is all great and all good. In fact, at the beginning of the story, he's not. And it's also not suggesting that Humbaba, this cedar demon, is all good or all bad. Humbaba's just doing his thing. He was sent there by Enlil to guard the cedar forest. And yet Gilgamesh and Enkidu roll in there, kill him. So some really interesting things there. Gilgamesh, you could argue that yes, he goes on a journey, but maybe this part of the story beforehand, he's kind of an anti-hero, and his arrogance is showing through. And this is, of course, what leads Humbaba to curse, Enkidu and say, yeah, Enkidu's going to die a horrible death, and you're going to have to live through that. And, of course, this is what happens through the introduction of Ishtar, who, of course, represents another character trope, the woman scorned. Because Ishtar had a long history of finding men who she loved and who she fell for, and then using them and then casting them aside. And Gilgamesh is like, no, I'm not going to be that guy. And Ishtar finds a way to get back at Gilgamesh through going after Enkidu. The shadow character, of course, the villain, is always going to be in world mythology. You have to have the balance. You have to have, if you're going to have good guys, you're going to have bad guys as well. Sometimes the shadow is not necessarily a physical, other person. It might be something within the hero that the hero has to vanquish from within. That is always possible. So you have the villains that are usually dressed in a foreboding way. You have clothing and the way we imagine these figures is always really interesting, because when I think of an underworld, for example, I don't think of a light, airy, beautiful, happy place. Now, if I think of a heaven, maybe I do, but when I think of an ancient Near Eastern underworld, I think of something that's dark and gloomy, and you've got a king or a queen, you've got some dead people wandering around. I don't necessarily think of it as a good, light, happy place. There are many other kinds of character types. You've got, you also, I could go over character types all day long, but we also have to think about other kinds of symbolism. Color symbolism, for example, shows up a lot in world mythology. You've got red, for example, which symbolizes passion, associated with violence and courage. You have other colors as well. For example, gold, oftentimes associated with wealth or the sun, fullness, ripeness, the harvest, for example. But it also could be associated with deceit or treason, cowardice, for example. Other symbols include stuff like the circle. The circle is like eternal. And a wedding ring. A wedding ring, the ring itself represents eternity. So there you have that. The bonds of family, unity, togetherness. There is no beginning. There is no end. Yeah. So why are these archetypes important? Well, it's because we want to see everything go right. We want things to be on the right course. We want to order the chaos. We want, light to prevail over the darkness. We want the moral life, the good life, to be the life that succeeds. We want there to be, we want their life to have meaning. And for us to be able to make meaning and say, okay, this is why this life is the good life, and this is why this life is the bad life. We want to be able to have some sort of moral compass to live by. And of course, religions do this through their rituals and their myth making, but the myths are the narratives themselves that reinforce why we do what we do, why we teach what we teach, why we act the way we do. So, these archetypes, as we talk about them, are really, this is really about people ordering their universe and experiencing and, filtering their experience in a way to help build their community. Remember, we're talking about the pre-modern world here. We're not talking about today. Well, actually, it doesn't matter. We could be talking about today as well. I mean, we're living in the midst of something that's been unprecedented for us, at least in this, the last 50 years, or so, and with this pandemic. And we have to make meaning. We have to build meaning in this time. And we are, certainly trying to figure that out in our own context now. It's going to be really interesting, the stories, the narratives, what's going to come out of this that historians and mythologists are going to study later on about how we determined, meaning, and how we, what stories did we tell to teach ourselves and to help ourselves and to hold our communities together. What stories are we telling to do that? I know that my part of the story is I just want to be bold and do my best to help my students. That's where I stand right now. So I don't want to go too far. I did want to talk a little bit about setting archetypes for a moment because you have time and place, but I also want to throw in something a little more modern. Think about a beautiful beach and you hear that merengue music, and yeah, it's getting a little closer to darkness. It's sort of dusky, but you hear that music and you just think you're going to walk down the beach, and you turn, you're going to go up and you're going to go get a nice chilly drink and hang out. You hear that music. But what happens if you envision that exact same scene? You're walking along the beach and you're about to turn, but instead of that music, you hear the music from the movie Jaws. Dun-na, 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 dun. Maybe your interpretation of what's going to happen is different. So you're getting something from that music. The music, the combination of visuals and auditory and everything, and of course you can add in the real world, smell, all of your experiences. You could have mixed signals, things telling you different things. So when I talk about archetypes, we always have to be mindful of the modern media representations of these older stories, and what we could do could get really creative. I'm really interested to see how things are going to change in the future when the experience isn't just audio and visual, but it's olfactory. Those, I forget what it's called. 3D, a hologram, I don't know what it is, but I just think we have to be mindful of the new technology now that helps along the way. All right, so there you have it on archetypes. I could go talk even more, but I'd like to stay under 25 minutes for each video. I will say this, archetypes are not uncontroversial. The idea of the collective unconscious, not uncontroversial. The study of world mythology through someone like Joseph Campbell, who talks about the monomyth, the hero with 1,000 faces, that says it all right there. The idea of building on your experiences and then looking for commonalities. Very, very interesting. So when we read and study mythology, we have to be mindful of these theories and we have to think about them. Above all, though, I want us to really engage the texts and really think about what those stories meant in that time and what they may mean still today. I think that is the power of mythology. What are the lessons? What are these cultures trying to? What are they speaking to from the past to us? What are they speaking to us? And what are they speaking to themselves? So think about that as you read, Gilgamesh and some of these Egyptian myths, because I think that is really where we can learn a lot about pre-modern world mythology.